Today I'm in Cambridgeshire at the Wicken Fens, and once upon a time much of the east of England was all like this, just miles and miles of wetland and bogs. Considered to be a dangerous, barren wasteland for most, there were still people that lived here and made a living fishing or raising livestock, and lived in small houses and outposts dotted around the Fenlands.
Wicken Fen is one of the very last wild fens in existence, the rest having been drained and cultivated, so what we see here is largely what people would have seen and experienced centuries ago. Crossing the fens was a very dangerous task during the day, but even more so at night. Even a local that had spent his whole life here could still lose his footing and fall into the bogs, being sucked into the murky waters below. But the treacherous bogs weren't the only thing that people had to be wary of. The Fenlands, and Wicken Fen in particular, was a well-known haunt of the Lantern Man. Last year, I made a video about the Will-o'-the-Wisp, the atmospheric ghostly lights that live mostly in marshlands and are known to lure people off the beaten track and into danger. The Lantern Men are quite similar, but different in a number of ways. They aren't floating orbs of light or fire, but instead appear as men holding lanterns, and are believed to be a lot more hostile. While the Wisp merely lure people into the bogs, the Lantern Men will seek people out and attack them. Thought to be evil spirits, the god-forsaken Fenlands are perhaps a fitting location for these things to haunt. The Lantern Men stalk the Fenlands at night, patrolling their territory and looking for a victim to drown in the dark waters. The unfortunate soul that was out on the fens at night would be filled with dread if they caught a glimpse of that lantern bobbing up and down in the clutches of the dark silhouetted man. The Lantern Men were drawn to the sound of whistling, so that's something to be avoided at all cost while out on the fens. Whistling is often proposed to ease the tension if you find yourself in a spooky or unnerving location, but it definitely isn't advised if you find yourself alone out here. However, it can save your life if you're out with a friend. In a 1900 copy of the Eastern Counties magazine, a proposed method of escaping the clutches of the Lantern Man is staggered whistling. Supposedly, if two men are on opposite sides of a field or maintain a good amount of distance, they can outsmart the ghoul. They spot the lantern, and so the first man whistles, and the Lantern Man makes his way towards him. As he's getting close, the second man whistles from across the fen, drawing the Lantern Man away from the first whistler and towards the new one. The men can keep advancing through the fens as they do this, sending the phantom back and forth until they're in the clear. If alone, however, the Lantern Man will still be on the hunt for you, regardless of whether you whistle or not. In this case, you must lie down on the ground, face down with your mouth in the mud, and hope that he passes over you. This method saved the life of a fisherman in the area who reported his encounter to the parapsychologist Peter Underwood. Upon seeing the Lantern Man having been drawn to his whistling, he threw himself to the floor and managed to survive. Another local once reported that he was on the Fenlands and whistled for his dog that had ran off. Naturally, the Lantern Man heard the whistle and slowly started to make towards the sound. The panicked local, realising what he'd done, managed to reach the house of a friend to take shelter. He hung out a horn on a long pole to distract the ghoul outside his house, and the next morning, the horn was all burned up. Upon seeing another light on the fens, the Lantern Man will head towards it, and he'll start to run, by all accounts. In the 1870s, Walter Rye wrote, "Once I heard of one following a man while he was carrying a lantern one night. The man knew what to do. He set the lantern down and ran away as if the devil kicked him. When he ventured to look round again, there was the Lantern Man, kicking the lantern over and over again."
Perhaps the most famous example of the Lantern Man claiming the life of someone out on the fens would be the case of Joseph Beckfield in the Norfolk Fens, and his unfortunate demise.
Joseph was a wherryman and had been enjoying drinking with his friends in 1809 when he remembered he'd left a parcel for his wife on the wherry. He knew the stories of the Lantern Man, but feared his wife's anger a lot more, so he left the warmth and safety of the inn and headed back to the boat to collect his package. His friends in the inn took the stories a lot more seriously, and they begged Joseph not to go, but Joseph insisted that he knew the fens well and was more than capable of finding his way home in the dark. He walked away from the lights of the inn and vanished into the darkness of the Fenlands, and this was the last time that he was seen alive. He never made it home, and his body finally turned up 3 days later. He'd been killed by the Lantern Man. He's buried in All Saints Church in Thirlton, but his ghost still haunts the fens to this day. Mr. Beckfield may not have taken the Lantern Man threat seriously, and this kind of disbelief often provoked extreme reactions from people. One account by a Mrs. Lubbock recalls a father coming home with an old man who whistled and jeered at the Lantern Man, whereupon the ghoul followed them and torched up the windows. Another account tells of a man knocking someone off his horse for disrespecting the Lantern Man. A Lady Cranworth of Letton relates a story told to her by an old fisherman, in which a young man was coming home one evening, and he saw the Lantern Man coming for him, and so he started to run as fast as he could. And he bumped into an old man who didn't believe his talk of silly superstitions. And so the young man ran on. He ran to the house of a friend called Giles, and banged on the door begging to be let in. Giles called the whole thing nonsense, but when he himself saw the Lantern Man outside, he let the young fellow in. He then held a candle outside of the window on the end of a pole, and the Lantern Man burned it up when he reached the house. This last detail seems to be a recurring theme. People placing objects outside the doors and windows, and the Lantern Man burning them up when he approaches. And if no items there, then he seems to burn the windows. A strange but consistent detail. There are those that try and explain away the will-o'-the-wisp and the Lantern Men as spontaneous combustions of marsh gas, a theory that scientists actually find borderline impossible to recreate even in perfect lab conditions. But almost every book or video you see on these phantoms that haunt the marshlands and fens will tell you this as a matter of fact. That's all it was, and that tales of ghostly lights or evil spirits are just made up to frighten children, or misunderstandings by people that didn't understand the gases. But these naysayers didn't live here, in the fens. Their gas combustion explanation simply does not match the countless stories and witness accounts from over the centuries. We like to think that there's a scientific, rational explanation for everything, but maybe, just maybe, the people that lived here for centuries and knew the fens like the back of their hands understood the dangers a lot more than we do. Fear of the Lantern Man was very real, and perhaps this was because the Lantern Man was, and is, very real. As always, a huge thanks to my patrons who made this video possible. It's because of them I was able to visit Wicken Fen in person and film on location. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I shall see you in the next one.